around 20 years. So it's, I guess it's sort of the third time that we've lived through this. You know, there was the initial SARS events in 2003, and then the H5N1 and H1N1 scares, each of which led to really quite a bit of thinking and discussing. So a lot of these slides were developed then, and I think it's useful to go through them, you know, as sort of an outline of the issues that come up. So I think that's what I'll do. So I gave you guys a general ethics lecture about 2 months ago, and so just, you know, there's many ways of looking at ethics. Sometimes people see it as oversight, but really in pandemic and other times, we recognize the need to balance competing values just more than ever, and that really is the task. And it's made so difficult when we're trying to understand the nature and extent of the danger, because you really need to know that in order to figure out. So although I'm not going to be discussing the precautionary principle, this is exactly the situation that calls for considering such a thing. How much attention do we need to pay to safety issues when miscalculations are potentially catastrophic? So in a time like this, we need sound decision making. We need to know that we're examining values. You know, and the really interesting part is examining relationships. What are those? How can people of good faith work together in unusual times? So then another thing to think about is the nature of the virtues. To what degree are each one of us sort of imbued with a natural tendency towards doing the right thing, you know, or its opposite, vice, doing the wrong thing? And being a human being, we are all trapped in the tension between those, between sort of selfish self-preservation and thinking of the good. And I think it's fair to say that those are natural things to think. And one thing I've noticed is that it is absolutely imperative that we live in the real world, not in some fake world when we're discussing these things. You know, so an example of that would be, you know, the discussions around, do healthcare providers deserve different considerations when it comes to possible ICU care? Really interesting discussions about whether it's fair and just to say the doctors and nurses at the front lines, if they get sick, have a slightly higher priority in a potential queue for intensive care. And I think the people that live in a sort of what I would call a fantasy theoretical world are ones who say that, well, doctors and nurses of good faith are going to come to work no matter what. They're duty bound to do the right thing. And I think that's where we have to remember, they're not exactly duty bound in the way that soldiers who might take an oath and say, yes, I pledge to sacrifice everything for my patients. I think the fact is that most doctors and nurses, while they may have thought that, have not explicitly done it. So we really need, my opinion would be to promise everything we can to the skilled professionals at the front line to ensure that they would continue to take care of us. The other thing we should consider in all of this is that it's fair to say that this is a mildly lethal strain. It's not the killer flu, you know, 20 or 30% death rate that we were sometimes imagining. And so hopefully that ends up being a bit of a gift for us all. So the goal is that every decision we have to make, every compromise that we need to find a balance to, that we find a way to do that. So we've got different types of ethical reasoning. I don't know why this keeps showing up. That's my son when he was 3. I think it has to do with my connection. So in decision making, the goal is well-informed decisions, deductive reasoning from principles, goal-based reasoning, all of these things we've discussed. Now here, this list of the values that show up in much of the literature. These are, and values in this context is sort of, here are the things we need to be considering in making plans for future or current pandemics. So just a quick, the duty to care. What's the nature of that duty? I don't think it should be overblown. Certainly doctors and nurses have duties, but they are simultaneously people with fears for their own well-being. The efficacy of proposed interventions. So just when it comes to the discussion of triage, and if we get saturated, who would get into an ICU and who would not? The first rule of that is based on, are they likely to get out of the ICU? How good is our evidence? And so a lot of really good, worthwhile discussion about how are we going to make such decisions who are clinically, when people are clinically equivalent. Will we start rationing according to age or other things? And I think there's a really healthy understanding that we don't want to discriminate against anybody unfairly, that we're cognizant of built-in biases in our society, and that we don't end up doing anything that's unfair. Really interesting discussions about age, and should age be a solid cutoff for ICU? My quick response would be, no, in normal circumstances, it should be completely your medical condition, your frailty score. How strong or not strong are you? But that's only when we've got the luxury of time. If there are 100 people waiting at your ICU and not just 10, then you don't have as much time to sort everybody out, and you would then have to go to cruder methods of sorting, like age. So far in Canada, I'm very optimistic that we're going to avoid the saturation scenarios in these first many weeks. And then if we do end up getting them in a second or third wave, we will in fact have hundreds more ventilators that can prevent some people from dying. So just other things, societal functioning. So you begin to see the tension of the prices that might need to be paid by people who feel that they are no longer able to be isolated. And so our societal functioning is something that week by week we're going to have to consider. I suspect the public health people will want us to stay separated, and it's highly predictable that each week people who have already been isolated for 2 or 3 or more weeks will be more and more resistant because they feel that they are safe. Justice and equity is for sure what we are going for in all of this. We don't want to overlook any of the things that are discussed about inequities in society that might put people at different starting points for all of this. And we know that currently and then after the fact, everybody who's in the system wants to be able to say, yes, that was a fair system for sorting people out. There weren't things we didn't think about that ended up being unfair built in. We want saving life is an enormous prime goal, as well as minimizing suffering. Things like organizational integrity. I think a big part of the ethics service is enabling the doctors and nurses to operate with integrity so that they don't get cast into that position of making impossible decisions, flying by the seat of their pants, that everything has been thought of and before and according to protocol, real commitment to that idea. Reciprocity is the principle I discussed before, that it's a fundamental human fact that if you scratch my back, I'll want to scratch yours. So I know that I've been urging the powers that be to not be telling doctors and nurses that it's their duty to come to the front line, but actually learning from anyone who's worked with volunteers knows it pays off to ask people really nicely, can you come help us? We need your skills, and they respond well to that. And I would say that not so much for this pandemic where I think people will come, but if you did have one that was much worse, you'd absolutely need to be able to offer the doctors and nurses at the front line, we will take care of you if by doing so you get ill and might die from this. To me, it's just crucial because we're human beings, we're not automatons. We need to give everything we can to the people whose skills we need to keep us alive. So just moving forward, we need to remember not only the healthcare community, but these relationships and duties to members of the public, to society. And we need to remember emergency responders. When we think of essential services, it's not just healthcare. People that keep our water and power and electricity running are even more essential than healthcare workers and need to be reassured that they'll get maximum protection. The virtues are something that we have seen a great deal of. I hope that you agree that we've seen a lot of heartening behavior, and we know that people will rise to the occasion in times of crisis. And so the golden rule always helps. If you're considering your own actions, what would you like to have happen if you were on the receiving end of that consideration? Whatever happens, the decisions on the ground will be made by people, hopefully of good faith, exercising sound judgment. And we do have this gift of a few weeks, it appears, to really finalize our plan. So hopefully that's what we'll be doing. And so for me, working as a clinical ethicist now at a hospital, basically for the Saskatchewan Health Authority, I've been very heartened to see that all of these ideas are being put into place, that preparations are being made for if we do get saturated, how would the process work? How would triage occur in a way that maximizes fairness, minimizes the chances of it being seen as unjust or unfair? And we're going to be starting to drill with different scenarios this week. So I think I've discussed most of these. It's just interesting when I see some of the slides I produced years ago, but the prevention of scarcity is the key thing we need to do in a pandemic. Right now, you're seeing in shortages of personal protective equipment and ventilators, a failure to prevent scarcity. Also on this slide are the reciprocity points that I made, that we really should be asking everybody nicely if they can help us fight this, especially if it gets bad. And so finally, the partnerships that are being formed are hopefully useful. Local organizations and potential sources of volunteers. As people recover from the virus, we're sure curious as to whether they'll be immune. Usually people are immune, but it isn't. But if they are, you can imagine that all of the recovered victims might have special roles to play, especially in the coming weeks, if they are indeed immune. You would have hoped that some years ago, people in Alberta would have thought about if we needed another 1,000 respirators, how quickly could we get them? Ideally, those plans would have been made in advance, and companies that could switch their operations would have been approached. And I am heartened that a lot of that will end up happening. Just a lot of the discussion years ago was about vaccine and vaccine distribution, and how really we are dependent on just a few places in the world for certain types of vaccine production. And I often wondered whether that should be spread around a little bit more. I am curious if this vaccine gets invented. We're interesting discussions about how it's allocated. It would likely take months to produce enough to vaccinate everyone. So there'll be additional discussions about order of vaccination. And this was always something I imagined. Timely mass isolation, given our knowledge of the microscopic world, is really going to help us, and that is obviously what we're experiencing now for the last few weeks. So I think I'll just stop there. Those are the types of issues that we in health ethics are looking at such a time. And I thought I would just give you a brief overview of that before, turning to you and asking what's on your mind. What have you been thinking about the ethical issues, and can we have a short discussion that might help help you think about some of the answers to those questions? So with that, does anybody want to jump in with either a question about any of my comments, or just to get right into the issue that you identified?
I guess you touched upon some of the biggest issues that have been coming up in the media, especially like the allocation of beds and ventilators. My question is, like, one, are we expecting to see any shortages in Alberta? And two, maybe moving away from beds and ventilators, how do we balance people's return to work and like return to social environment with needing to stay isolated to prevent second, third, or future waves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the second part is one I've given a lot of thought to.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's predictable that isolation is difficult, and it's going to become increasingly difficult week by week by week.
Right.
In ethics, you almost always are forced to try to explore middle ground. And you can imagine that those who are obsessed with safety and saving life above all other considerations are not going to want us to go back to work.
Right.
Because it partly has to do with trust, that we the public are not trusted to successfully execute the distancing.
Right.
But at the same time, when you look at the thousands and thousands of small businesses, I'm thinking not of companies with 100 people, but where there's 3 to 10 people, that are 80% of them are not running.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the economic costs of that, while still manageable, will start to increase week by week by week in the way of desperate people, restless people, and we will be forced to consider the costs of continued isolation.
Right.
But when I consider the middle ground, I would like to think that we'll be able to initiate a dialogue with responsible Albertans who can honestly look at themselves and say, I've been self-isolating. I live with people that have been self-isolating. Therefore, I can with confidence say that I'm not currently ill.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think there would be many places of business where, maybe 3 or 5 of the 10 employees could go and start to get things running again in some of those businesses, and that we could do so without a spike in cases. So I would imagine that sort of compromise is something we'll need to be discussing soon, just because people will get restless, and they will increasingly feel that they themselves are not sick. And so I think we need to plan for that.
Especially as the weather gets better.
Yes, exactly. And so I think we're still just a few weeks in and people can get their heads around it. But like I said, it's very predictable that restlessness will increase. And that will depend on that key question of how severe is it? What are the numbers gonna like?
Yeah.
If we have one of those days of doubling, that coming up, I think everybody gets a little bit more concerned and whatnot.
Right.
What was the first part of your question? I'm forgetting that part.
Like how bad is it? Like, what are we expecting to see? When is it expected to peak?
So, okay, well, I've been in Saskatchewan for 3 weeks, but I'm watching the numbers.
Yeah.
You in Alberta, your numbers aren't quite as heartening as the Saskatchewan numbers, but they are still relatively low. what you ask is a big unknown. My
Yep.
hunch, and I am guilty, like I've admitted to you guys before, I'm an optimistic person, and I sometimes skew too optimistic. But I honestly think that the physical distancing that we've initiated 2+ weeks ago
Mm-hmm.
is in fact going to keep the numbers low enough that I don't expect to see saturation in a prairie province in the next 3 weeks.
Okay.
And that, again, I could be completely wrong, but like I said in the presentation, I really think if we can get through this month, by sometime in May or June, all of those miraculous newly built ventilators are going to start appearing.
Right.
And really, it does come down to, if we fail to distance and all of a sudden, the 200 ventilators in Alberta are not enough. That's when the tragedy begins. That's, when you look at Italy and the tragedy, that's what happens when you've got no more ventilators.
Yeah.
People who would normally be put on them simply don't have them.
Yeah.
So I'm optimistic that we are not going to have that. I'm less optimistic about some of our American cousins in the next few days.
Yeah.
I think they are riding the edge of their limitations.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll just have to see how it goes. But
Okay.
but so far so good in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Or at least in Western Canada. I'll even say
not sure
the
what's
prairie
happening
provinces.
in Quebec and Ontario right now.
Well, it's hard to know.
Yeah.
But I like our numbers better than theirs.
For sure.
My question, since we're talking about America, there's been talk about using an anti-malaria drug that possibly, and there's a lot of questions that I've seen people asking if it's ethically right to use a drug where you don't know the repercussions of it for something that it's not meant to be used for. And I was just wondering what your thoughts on that were.
Yeah. I'll try to remain objective and not political in any way. It is natural that people will start to look for any and everything that might help them in this. We also know that people are not purely rational creatures, and so public speculation about other drugs that could conceivably help, that most responsible officials who are aware of public health realities, wouldn't dare just throwing out some ideas of drugs they think might work. And the reason is that some people will hear that and go get those drugs and start taking them. And that's why we need to be so careful. So I think the messaging about how far or how well are we doing in exploring treatments among possible interventions that already exist, that it is just the height of irresponsibility to mention any of those publicly. I do struggle, like I think everybody, in understanding some of the time frames. You guys know that I'm a little affected by science fiction, and in most science fiction, the time between identifying the agent and the vaccine being ready, is 1 hour. That might represent a few days
Right.
in there. But even so, I think I remain optimistic that maybe the vaccine development won't, that maybe after 6 to 8 months they've made some progress and not the 12 to 18 that is usually the case. So absolutely, we are not at a point, even close to it, where so many people are dying that they should start experimenting with home brews and drugs that are created for other diseases in the hope that they might work. It's very dangerous messaging for the public.
So some of those anti-malarial drugs in combination with others have a known side effect of cardiac arrhythmias.
Right.
And some of the deaths have been due to that. In other
Yep.
words, you're taking two different agents, both of them lengthen the QT interval, and the people die because of that. So it's important to keep in mind that not everybody dying with COVID-19 has died of it. Some of them have died of the treatment. So yeah, that's just another factor.
But yeah, I mean, it raises some really interesting health ethics questions about research. You know, our regime for research ethics and protecting research subjects from getting taken advantage of is very robust. You know, we want to make sure that that any test that you're going to be asked to be a part of is safe and that you're fully informed about it. And so, you know, what will come up is a so-called right to try issue.
Right.
You know, so patients who, you know, feel that they could use a drug are being told that there isn't one, feel that they should be able to try stuff that's out there. And so I think one of the challenges is how do you set those reasonable limits that are going to protect people from being sold lethal interventions from unscrupulous people to those who, you know, to what degree do we suspend the normal testing rules and allow people to voluntarily put themselves at risk in order to hopefully get something quicker? And, you know, I would say certainly to some degree, you know, that we should be a little more open than usual to people who are willing to try stuff out. You know, interesting discussions. Usually vaccines would go through animal testing before human testing. So some of you might have read that, you know, I think they're going to try some human testing concurrently with animal testing.
Right. Yeah.
Which for sure subjects some people to extra danger. You know, but the ethical challenge in all of these things is how much extra danger is reasonable. You know, and what information do we have that might help us answer that question? Because the line of reasonability is the thing that's moving, and it depends entirely on the actual extent of the danger. You know, and mostly we're dealing with perceived extent of danger. We don't know the actual extent. We've just each developed our own gut feeling as to how dangerous is this really.
So it seems to me that I kind of discovered something at the bank. There was this whole line of people gradually moving into the bank because they had things that they wanted to do at the bank. And they were just a subset of sort of normal human beings. And so they had that whole spectrum of human behavior. And gradually, because it took about an hour and a half, the people who were just talking nonstop on their phones with conversations no one else were interested in, that stopped. The people who sort of glowered and gnashed their teeth and did other sort of unfriendly things, that also stopped. And it occurred to me that if we do this long enough, people will get the idea that their behavior needs to be in a certain range, or people won't let them in the line any longer, you know? So it's sort of interesting from that point of view. Then you get to the end of this line, right? And in ordinary times in this bank, there are transactions that are personal and business. So there's a sign, personal, business, and so on. But by that time, you've been waiting maybe 2 hours to get there. You're just desperate to talk to a bank employee. So you just go to the next open wicket. And of course, as luck would have it, you have a business transaction, and this is the personal wicket. But you know, somebody points that out, you get so irritated, you know. But anyway, that's just the way life is. So, yeah.
Yeah. So anybody else have things on their minds or responses to the question about?
I do have a question, Gary.
Okay.
So I was reading an article that recently came out and discussing Canada's closure of borders and closure of international flights. And that has caused a problem because if there were refugees seeking asylum in Canada, they're not permitted to enter. Now, how do you think these public health preventative measures impact human rights measures in order to, protect ourselves, but also prevent the refugees from incurring more harms if they were, say, deported?
Yeah. Well, again, I don't expect the questions are going to be easy questions. I think that in unusual times, the ongoing thing is how much do the regular rules or the regular way things work need to be suspended for the sake of public safety. And I think the problem you're describing, is yet another example where we're trying to identify the needs, wants, and rights of these specific individuals, who have been going through these things and are now, in a sense, in limbo. And to what degree do our public health needs, the worries of the population, can they be cited as reason enough to deny normal rights or normal approaches? And so I mean, my sense is that everybody who is in this state of international limbo, whether a refugee, a legitimate refugee, an undocumented refugee, or somebody simply traveling internationally that's gotten caught, I think they're all in the same boat. That while we are in this early phase of uncertain, we don't know quite how dangerous it is to let people in, and we're erring on the side of caution still. But I think it is related to what I said earlier, that week by week by week, the public health are, for the sake of our public health, that becomes less compelling as a reason to deny the normal rights or normal expectations of people like refugees. So I mean, I guess my sense is that it's understandable for now, highly regrettable. You would hope that the government can devote a little bit of resources to providing interim comfort for such people, especially if they're trapped in a location, sort of in limbo. But it's an inevitability of the public health crisis that a small percentage of individuals are going to have the bad luck of being victimized by this, I think.
Thank you.
Okay.
So it isn't just refugees, like people who are in the process of becoming permanent residents here, landed immigrants, that sort of thing. A lot of companies and institutions rely on recruiting from outside of Canada, and that is just going to slow way down. So in that sense, it's likely that a lot of jobs will go to Canadians that in a previous era would have a worldwide search. So you can think of that as having both upsides and downsides, but it is a reality now.
I'm wondering if I can ask a question, since it's one
Sure.
of my challenges at the time. Is what do each of you think of the idea that no 80-year-old should be allowed access to the ICU in a time like this? Does the idea of an age, a number, irritate you, or do you think it's sort of a necessity as one of the initial sorting mechanisms? I know that I'm comfortable with the age, the higher it is. I could say with confidence that a 95-year-old should almost never go to the ICU, but I have trouble saying that, for anyone in their 80s. Sometimes a strong 80-year-old will absolutely benefit from a few days in the ICU. So I mean, I know, so far my advice has been, let's just stick to frailty scores and keep age out of it. But I'm curious whether you guys think age.
So I would remind you that Willie Nelson is 87, and he just put out a new album, and he's going fine. And he talks, the quote is, "I think young people should start thinking what kind of world they're leaving for Keith Richards and Willie Nelson. You know, you can't really predict which way things are going to go. Young people think they're going to outlive Willie Nelson and Keith Richards, but they might not. So, yeah, well, I obviously have a bias. I don't think absolute age cutoffs make much sense, but, you know, that's my bias.
I don't think cutoffs really are fair either. I don't like the idea of them. My sister works in the ICU in Amarillo, Texas, and she has patients, most of them elderly, and she's actually seen a lot of them recover and be moved out of the ICU.
Yeah.
I think, you know, you hear of stories of like elderly individuals refusing ventilators or refusing treatment in places like Italy in favor of giving them to younger people. And then you also hear of stories of people who are, you know, in their like 90s, or there was like a 102-year-old guy just a couple of days ago who have successfully recovered and like undergone ventilation, and they're fine now. So I think it's hard to like blanketly say no, people over a certain age don't deserve treatment. I feel like you also have to consider like different comorbidities, and then maybe include age as like one of the factors, but not a deciding factor.
Yeah.
Because if you have like a 60-year-old who's been smoking for 20 years, that might have a bigger impact than, you know, just the raw age.
Yeah, I think you're right. And my hope is that by using all the other criteria, scoring criteria, physical ability, that you're going to answer the main question, which is who's most likely to benefit. I mean, the kicker that I've been struggling with is that ideally, I mean, we could decide on some sort of social worth whom to pick. But I think that it's fair to say that a great number of elderly people would say, yeah, I would love to be on a ventilator if you think it will help me. But if it's between me at age 80 and this guy at age 50, please take them.
Right.
And I think that there's quite a few people that would say such a thing. You know, it's sort of like, if you've got an extra one, I'll take it. But, you know, if you're literally having to decide between me and that younger person, please take the younger person. And so I'm trying to figure out how can we learn more about that? Is there any way that we can initiate that type of discussion with people who, you know, are aging and starting to have some illnesses? And you know, anyway, it's been interesting, because among the discussions of ethicists have just been, yeah, we should, during this in-between time, ask everybody what their wishes are for end-of-life care in general. But I always think, well, here's a new question you could throw in there. If it's, you know, by all means, we're going to, you know, if you want ICU care, if you need it, and we've got a ventilator, absolutely. But if the day that you want it, we are rationing or triaging, I think that at least half the people would say, you know, I've had a good life. And I would include Willie Nelson and Keith Richards. You know, that you know, they both, one would have thought, might have ended their lives in their 60s, but you can't predict such things.
Do you think that Canada or even America will reach a point where they have to use age as a choice?
Yes, like I said earlier, the more dire the daily situation, like there's sort of a difference if you, like, say you've got a unit of 50 ventilators, you know, and there's 10 people at the door, and you can sort of imagine that some of them are going to get in and some of them won't. and you probably got a little time. But then you imagine there's 100 people waiting, okay, and you know, a totally different animal. And so that's where I think you would not be able to take the time for the, you know, the fine assessments and diagnostics to really figure out in a substantial way who's likely to benefit. So I think it's related directly to the nature of today's scarcity as to how crude the rules need to be. So when it gets really bad, you know, Italy has just been so instructive. You know, when the lineup outside is 1,000, you end up things, nobody over 60 is getting in here. And, you know, again, that just, it boggles the mind that we would have gotten to such a place in this day and age. But, you know, so I think the better job we do of prevention, maximizing resources, keeping people apart, the more easily we will be able to stick to the proper criteria as opposed to just the crude ones. Because if the worse it gets, you don't have time for triage. You know, it's just, let's try to save as many people as we can. And so hopefully I've infected you a bit with my optimism that at least in Canada, we're not going to get there. But there are pockets in America right now,
Mm-hmm.
you know, New York City in particular, but others that they are coming dangerously close to that time. And, you know, you just, you know, I don't know if you guys have been to New York, but it's a pretty different
place.
when 1,000 people live in a block as opposed to, you know, about 40 that live in a block in Edmonton. Really hard to keep away from each other.
Yeah, it's a really emotional thing for me. My father grew up in New York City, and his mother lived there for most of her life. And recently, our family has had maybe the very best times traveling there. We've had wonderful times, you know. So the city is sort of always in my mind, and one of the places that I really love. So it is so sad that it's like the focus of the worst.
Yeah. So, I mean, the other thing that I'm encountering just in ethics practice is the impact this is having on, you know, just good old regular families whose loved ones are having good old regular illnesses.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so, you know, real tough consultation this week about a stroke victim. And, you know, stroke is always a fairly serious stroke in an 85-year-old woman. And often you don't know just how bad it is at first, but it's just so distressing for families to not be able to be at the bedside. You know, which is, you know, if she were deemed to be dying, they would be allowed to visit, but it's not, you know, they think that she's going to do okay. And you can see this family just struggling, whether is it better to leave grandma alone in a stroke unit for the next several days, which maximize her physical care of her physical needs, or should they try to get her home, which puts her in some physical danger, but at least puts familiar faces around her, you know, in a typical stroke where you're not quite sure if the person can understand you and they're not able to talk, but they're still there and vigorous. So just really, it complicates all sorts of decisions in the healthcare system right now.
Adding to that, I actually know that a couple of days ago, one of my friends on Facebook posted the fact that his father was probably suffering from a stroke or a TIA or something, and he's probably in his 70s, and the fear of COVID and being outside kind of trumped the fact that he needed actually an emergency visit. So ultimately, they decided to stay home and wait out the virus rather than go visit the emergency room because of these, I'd say, like, based on what you know about COVID and how much it's affected Alberta, kind of unfounded. Do you think there's going to be maybe an increase in morbidities of other diseases compared to COVID in the next few months?
Yes, I think it's easy to predict that that is not a lone case, that people's fears will keep them from getting needed treatment. And the unfortunate thing is, you can recognize that that would be a really tough call if you're really afraid of the virus and you think you might be having a stroke that the system might have some medication for. Really tough decision. I mean, my hope would be that every such person is on the telephone with proper health authorities discussing the pros and cons. I mean, I think it's likely that there's a whole bunch of people whose fear that if they go to a hospital they'll get infected is a little overblown. I mean, precautions still are made pretty well. For me personally, I've been at a hospital daily for the last 10 days, and I'm aware that I'm at slightly higher risk than the average person. But when I hear that scenario, my first thought is the hospital is probably not nearly as dangerous as they fear it is. But again, fear is not a rational emotion, and that's part of the challenge in how, trying to incorporate level of fear into your ethics calculation. That it isn't rational. You can't really say this is how afraid you ought to be.
Yeah.
Although
the risks can't be precisely identified anyway, because hospitals are very heterogeneous places. Like we figure in laboratory medicine that if we leave the hospital and go outside, we're definitely at higher risk in the surrounding community than we are in our own offices and things within laboratory medicine, because there are no actual patients here. They're just samples. They're things that come from patients, but not the actual patients. So our risk within the hospital is lower than it would be outside. But other parts of the hospital, the risk is substantially higher. So, it's a very heterogeneous thing.
Yep. All right. Anything else on anybody's mind about COVID or your paper? Well, we've got some minutes for ethical deliberation still available.
So, Solani, did you want to pose some of the questions about genetic enhancement to this larger group of people, or?
Sure. So my paper topic is about eugenics and designer babies and like human modification. And so I kind of opened by talking about where we are right now and like the CRISPR babies, and then talking about what exactly counts as an enhancement and like what versus correction of a disease. And then I talk about like how far we can take that in terms of artificial modifications. And so two things that I was kind of thinking about was, one, and Dr. Spills and I were talking about this at the beginning, if you introduce genetic editing, my original thought was that it would decrease human genetic diversity, and it would make our population more homogeneous, which is detrimental to our own survival. So that was kind of one of my first thoughts. And then my second thought, kind of at a later stage, is what are the moral implications of allowing someone to replace a healthy body part with like an artificial replacement? So like instead of like genetically modifying your eye, could you just replace your eye with like an electronic camera that it has better functionality than your actual eye? And like, is it okay to do something like that?
Mm-hmm. All right. So are you looking for answers, or is that the question and now you're going to tell me the answer?
Well, answers would be great. I always appreciate answers. Solutions, clean, easy solutions to
Yeah.
these ethical
Well,
questions.
I'm okay. Well, I'll start by exploring. You know,
Okay.
I mean, I think that underneath your question is the nature of how are we going to distribute goods and services of various types going into the
Right.
future. You know, particularly those that involve body parts and new fancy eyes or ears
Yep.
that improve us. I mean, I think to some degree, the spectrum of possible answers mirrors almost a political system.
Mm-hmm.
You know, free, unfettered liberty, where
Yep.
people can do whatever they want. You know, would just leave it to the markets. You know, that who is anyone or any authority to tell two people what they can or can't do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so that would be sort of the radical libertarian idea that all people should be free to do whatever they want. And now I think that is obviously problematic because of the nature of goods and services that pose dangers to all of us. So, you know, if they were just trading rocks or little things that didn't affect us all, we could let them do that. But, you know, I think what the modern age has brought with, you know, along with unleashing unbelievable technological power, is the ability to you know, to really harm us. You know, so microbes and nuclear things are the ones that come to mind first, but they're not the only ones. You know, I've always thought that while capitalism and free markets work great for normal widgets,
Yep.
that when you're talking about
not for
human
healthcare.
body parts or things that are
Yep.
extremely valuable to people, that they don't follow the normal rules of markets because people are so desperate, and desperate people will then pay way more than that thing should actually be worth. And that's, you know, that, so I would base my argument on limiting free markets around essential services because of that. Like, it's, you know, that you're going to get people fleecing each other, and you need to create an ethic where that is seen to be not right. You can absolutely try to sell this jacket to somebody else for $1,000, but if you're selling an eyeball or an ear, it has to be appropriate market rate, right? So I don't know. I think that much like the current research community, where there is an initial vetting of what is safe for people, should probably take place. So I can imagine, if you're working on new eyes or ears, that there will come a point where the new eye or ear substitute is safe, does work better, has been tried in enough people that all of the risks are known, and could conceivably be something that somebody can just order up, you know, super hearing or super sight. How far that goes, I don't know. What we can rely on is that people will want to make life better for themselves and their children.
Yeah.
They will want to give their children every advantage. But I think we humans are imbued with a sense of justice. And so I can guess that a lot of, you know, however this goes, people will say, you know, good old-fashioned eyes probably do most of what we need them to do. When we need better sight, we can add something to it. But I really worry that if left unchecked, it would almost be a keeping up with the Jones type of phenomenon, where if, you know, wealthy people all got super hearing, you develop this sort of peer pressure. And I can imagine, you know, it going in sort of a bad direction, that everybody thinks they need a new eye. Now, in some ways, I could apply that argument to what's happening currently today in cosmetic surgery. You know, all sorts of other ethical issues related to cosmetic surgery. Not that people should be able to pay people to help them, but real questions as to whether physicians who are trained in medicine should really, do they have an obligation to help the public in more fundamental traditional medical interventions than the bandwagon. Again, very, very hard rules to make, because if you're just a physician that wants to go into the cosmetic business and you go to medical school so that you can do that, we shouldn't be able to judge you for that. But at the same time, there is this public nature of medical training that the public did help pay for your education, so there is this, at least some idea of reciprocity that
when you talk about like what could happen if we leave things unchecked, to what extent do you think regulatory bodies like governments are obligated to step in and deal with this?
Well, I think that what we've seen in the last 6 weeks are various governments experimenting with that very question.
Yep.
Because it's not clearly defined, especially in a political system where the main political discussion in every Western country is should government be this involved or this involved?
Yeah.
It's a little skeptical about political discussions, because I think in my lifetime it's just been this discussion about how do you divide this pie, and it's never struck me that their positions are that different from each other.
Yeah.
So I think that governments who know that they've got obligations the fundamental obligations to their citizens are to create a culture where their citizens can thrive and be safe.
Yeah.
Without unduly overseeing such individuals. So I'd like to think that most government or political entities, at least in North America, have been trying to find where those lines are in good faith. So that's what I could say.
Okay.
Hannah, do you have questions that we could help you with your presentation?
I don't really have any for mine. I'm doing my paper and presentation over tissue engineering. So
I see. Yeah.
So the ethics, I feel, aren't as, the way I see it, they're not as confusing as Maloney's, but there's obviously ethical implications with tissue engineering and the stem cells that it involves and things like that. So if you have any comments or suggestions on the ethics behind tissue engineering, I'll definitely like to hear it.
Well, I think that clearly tissue engineering and our ongoing use of stem cells to explore just what these things might be capable of is absolutely central to what we're trying to do in medicine, which is to understand human disease and illness and fix it. I think it's predictable, that for anybody who's dealing with stem cells, that there'll be certain questions about where do those stem cells come from, and those are they're sort of laden politically, potentially, because of the various sources of stem cells. We can get them from adults and children, but we can also get them from embryos. That so I think that for somebody like you who's working in that you might catch hints in the background of people concerned with anybody using stem cells. I think it's always worth considering the arguments, the objections that such people have, which I think is a healthy respect for human life in whatever that might look like. And so I can imagine that you can never get completely away from the potential of that criticism from some quarters when you're working with stem cells. But I would just say that the larger, the question of, is that a human life or not, is, that we're not going to be able to answer that. I would say that it's, in the end, there's no fundamental reality to that. We have to collectively decide when do we think human life begins, and when does it not. And, you know, and if we think that we're going to discover the true moment of that spark, we're not. You know, it's arbitrary. So for me, from that understanding, you know, I think it's probably helpful for you to think about what you're getting into. But I probably, like you, have very high hopes that stem cells, as we learn more about them, will be one of the keys to our conquering of a whole bunch of illness and disease.
Yeah. So going on a different, besides stem cells, some scaffolds that are used in tissue engineering are xenogenic, so animal derived. And I've, from my research, obviously there's people who have issues with using animal tissue, people who have issues putting it inside their own body, or people who have issues with, for lack of a better term, sacrificing an animal to get the tissue. So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that in some ways that is also a fairly modern issue that represents a deep sense of compassion in human beings. You know, a recognition that sentience might not be only exclusive to humans, and that we shouldn't immediately discount the moral worth of animals. That you know, I think a lot of us that have dogs and cats are pretty in tune with the idea that, you know, these are not mere valueless creatures. They are, you know, there's something going on there. At the same time, I know that I am personally affected, and I always try to ask myself, to what degree are my opinions culturally embedded? But I think to some degree, I come from a biblical tradition where human life is more valuable. You know, that if we can save a human life, that is a real intrinsic good because of a fundamental belief in, you know, whether you call it sacredness or value. And while I love animals, you know, the bigger and smarter the animal, the more I respect them. You know, I still, I guess, can accept the fact that there's something distinct about human life that makes it worthwhile. But I think that that we should be careful about, going forward, about what sentience is, and we should think about the sacrifices that animals make for us, whether in research or in a bit of meditation before we're about to eat them. But I would bring it home by saying that we live in a real world where we ourselves are animals and a part of nature. We are only some centuries removed from being savage animals living in the wild. And so I think I can live with the need for a little bit of killing, because we're not yet the godlike spiritual beings that we might eventually become. We're part of nature. Nature is bloody and involves a lot of killing for survival. So, and I would say that civilization, human civilization, is the act of overcoming that savage nature. But we are still animals. So I would build my response on that.
So Hannah, there's kind of an interesting sidelight of this, and it also brings to mind the question of what kind of authority we bring to bear on these questions, you know, how we decide who we believe. So in August 2000, the International Transplant Congress was in Rome, and the Pope spoke to us at that conference. And the day before the Pope spoke, the Vatican circulated his text, and a lot of it was about stem cells, stem cell origins, what should be allowed, and very, very specific regenerative medicine things. So I was running the best known email discussion group at the time, and I wondered whether I could pre-circulate the text and get some feedback on this. So I wrote to various addresses at the Vatican about this. And finally, I got back a definitive email from admin@vatican.org saying that I could indeed circulate the text. But it wasn't clear really who that was. But you have to admit that's a pretty impressive email address. So anyway, yeah, sometimes word comes down with great authority. So, yeah.
In situations like this, I always find it interesting that a lot of times when people from like different views, so like people who say are religious and they believe in the Bible, almost like you were saying, how we have authority over animals in a way, and then there's the people who are don't like obviously using animals for research and things like that, but on like issues like tissue engineering, they come together and they almost have the same stance where they're against it because of the use of stem cells or the use of xenogenic tissue. I just find it interesting that you can have completely different points of view but come together to the same solution, not solution, but same opinion.
Yeah.
So there's an equally important ethical problem having to do with stem cells, and that is stem cell fraud, right? So setting up a clinic, in theory, there are very few rules about what you can do with your own cells, right? So if you go to this clinic, they take some of your blood and then give you something back. It's hard to really regulate that, but it's possible to charge money for it. May seem like a thing you'd only find in foreign countries or other provinces, but we have such clinics right here in our province. And so that is an equally important ethical question, because some of these people who get injections, I mean, you might think the worst thing is to get saline, so they charge you to give you something that can't possibly work, right? But what's even worse is when there are active cells in there, but they create, disfiguring calcifications and stuff, exactly the opposite of what you want. They make the situation worse rather than better. So that's another ethical side of regenerative medicine. In these times, you would think that the activity at such clinics would be kind of low, right? So that's what I think. It is, it's sort of, elective procedure, right? So, and you can't travel anyway. So probably this sort of ethical problem with people flying from all over the world to go places that claim, miraculous cures that actually have no scientific basis, probably the amount of that activity decreases quite a lot when you have a worldwide pandemic. It doesn't mean that people are becoming more ethical, it's harder to do the unethical things. Certain kinds of crime that are probably not very easy to do with social distancing rules. Pickpockets are probably having a very hard time now. So, yeah.
Well, I think in the boardroom of those companies, Kim, they talk about how do we hint that our stem cell treatment is going to protect against COVID-19.
Yes, that's right. Yeah.
That would be the business model.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're 4 minutes after 3:20. So I want to thank you all for taking part in our first ever Zoom session in the course. I think it's been quite successful, quite interesting, and yeah. So
yeah.
Thank you.
Definitely it works pretty well, this Zoom. I've been using the Google Hangouts, and this is pretty effective, how each of you just pops onto the screen of my phone when you start talking. And
yes, it's almost too easy in that now there are bad guys who are creating pornographic videos exactly to, disrupt Zoom meetings. But they only target the really high profile ones, or the ones that they don't like the politics of. And we were very unlike, that's called a Zoom bomb. So those people who are putting out Zoom bombs, I think they would have very little interest in, disrupting what we're doing here. But yeah, anyway, that is the danger with a, technology that's very easy to use and works well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right. Well, I just want to, thank you guys for your ongoing interest in ethical issues. I mean, normally we're talking about the ethics of the future of medicine, but I guess these are unusual times. So just thank you again for involving me, and feel free at any time to be in touch if you want to chat about ethical issues.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay.
Thank you all. Okay.
Okay. Bye. Take care.
Bye-bye. Take care.
All right.